All right, it's late night on Tuesday night, actually 12:30 on the dot, and that means that Joe Lisi from GoForThe2.com joins us to break down college football. We've done this for 14 consecutive weeks, Joe, and the games just keep getting bigger and bigger and the stakes higher and higher. And here we come down to the last regular season week. We've got 14 games, and they all mean a whole bunch. So here we go, Joe. Let's start. I'm not going to go Thursday, Friday, Saturday. I'm going to bunch this up into conferences. So let's start with the Thursday matchup in the Big 12. So we've got TCU, who comes into this thing at number 5 in the country, just outside of the top 4 for the college football playoff, going to Texas to take on a very improved Longhorns team.
Mark, TCU is 2-29 since 1968 against Texas. Their last victory came a couple of years ago on Thanksgiving night against the Longhorns. Trev Boykin led that offense to the hard-fought victory, but this is a very difficult matchup for TCU for a couple of factors. You look at that Texas defensive front, 37 sacks through 11 games. They're very solid in the secondary, only giving up 182 passing yards per game. You saw what they were able to do a few weeks ago against Clint Trickett and that high-octane Mountaineer offense. They were able to rush the football with Malcolm Brown and Jonathan Gray. If they're able to do that against TCU, I like Texas in this ballgame. You look at the quarterback swoops, acclimated into Charlie Strong's system, and Charlie Strong's a big game head coach, always has his teams prepared for big games, and I think Texas strikes the upset Thursday night. I like the way they're playing on both the offensive and defensive lines, and you're talking about a team in TCU that over the years has struggled traditionally against the Longhorns, a lot falling on this Horned Frog team, and I think Texas strikes the upset on Thanksgiving night.
Joe, TCU does get the bye week at the right time. They were kind of dragging a close game against Kansas in particular on the road. They do get the bye week before the Texas game, but the Longhorns, as you mentioned, Charlie Strong, Sugar Bowl upset against Florida on his resume, has pulled off some big wins in his career, and this would be a huge one in knocking off TCU. Texas is supposed to be the team fighting for national championships, not TCU, but right now it's the Horned Frogs on top with Texas trying to get back to that level. So we've got Baylor as well. It's the TCU versus Baylor show in the Big 12, and who's getting better style points. Right now, TCU's in the lead, but Baylor's got the head-to-head. Baylor could probably, if they win out with the Kansas State win on the last day of the season, would probably win with the head-to-head matchup, but it wouldn't hurt to get some style points in their matchup against Ohio State possibly. The Baylor Bears taking on Texas Tech.
Absolutely. You look at both of these teams in TCU and Baylor, both on the outside looking in at this point in the season, week number 14. I would think that if TCU gets the victory over Texas and then Baylor gets the solid victory on December 6th over Kansas State, in my opinion, Baylor would leapfrog TCU in that position. You look at what Kansas State has been able to do down the stretch. They got a solid road victory against West Virginia and Clint Trickett in the Mountaineer offense a couple of weeks ago on Thursday night. If Baylor can have a solid victory over Kansas State, I think Baylor gets the nod over TCU at this point in the season. In my opinion, the head-to-head means everything, and in that situation, Baylor would get the playoff berth over TCU, in my opinion.
All right, Joe, maybe the most impressive team last weekend was that UCLA performance against USC at the Rose Bowl. The Bruins blew out USC 38-20. Wasn't even really that close after a quick pick six by USC against Brett Hundley. UCLA came back and really trashed the Trojans in this one. So they've got Stanford, who's still a strong defensive team, but missing some key parts of that offense compared to what they had in 2013. Ty Montgomery's an issue. He won't see the field. So we've got Stanford taking on UCLA on Friday. Bruins win. They're in the Pac-12 championship game.
I like the way UCLA is playing. You look at their performance last week against arch rival USC, held that USC offense to 63 rushing yards. That was the difference, in my opinion, to force USC to be one-dimensional. They were able to create pressure on Cody Kessler, create turnovers, and then their offensive line protected Brett Hundley. That was the difference. You look at this offensive line, struggled over recent weeks in terms of protecting Brett Hundley. Since that Arizona game, though, they've seemed to mend the issues that they've had on the offensive and defensive lines, and they're really coming together at just the right time. I don't think Stanford's a team to pull off the upset in the Rose Bowl this weekend because, in my opinion, they're not able to stretch teams vertically with quarterback Kevin Hogan. They got a solid victory over arch rival Cal last week, but in my opinion, UCLA playing over Stanford this weekend.
Okay, Joe, it's the Civil War. Oregon State. Conventional thinking would say that the Beavers don't have much of a chance, but if you recall last year, they gave Oregon all they could handle. Sean Mannion was throwing the ball all over the field. It was a 35-34 game. Ducks playing great football. They've got the offensive line issues in check now, protecting Marcus Mariota much better in recent weeks. He's been of course, having probably the best season of any quarterback in the country. Again, Sean Mannion may give the Beavers a bit of a puncher's chance. They did upset Arizona State at home. We got Oregon and Oregon State.
Tough matchup, but you look at that Oregon State offensive line. They're surrendering 34 sacks on the season through 11 games. That doesn't bode well going up against a very solid defensive front in Oregon that could create turnovers. They're plus 15 in turnover margin, very opportunistic, and have speed off the edge that can get to Sean Mannion. He struggled against teams like USC that were able to create pressure and force him out of the pocket. So I don't think this is a good matchup for Oregon State at home. I think they have too much speed, the Ducks do, and can create turnovers. I think that's the difference. Anything can happen, but I like the speed of Oregon on the road in Corvallis. I think they get a convincing victory this coming Saturday in the Civil War and knock off the Beavers in a big way.
Arizona State's going to have to do some scoreboard watching while they take care of the Wildcats. At the same time, Arizona State needs a UCLA loss to give them the opportunity with a win over their arch rival to get to the Pac-12 championship game against Oregon. Arizona State would seem to be the better football team overall, but Arizona's had a nice year under Rich Rod. It's Arizona State going on the road to take on the Wildcats.
Interesting, because the whole key to this matchup is whether Anu Solomon is healthy in this ball game. He's listed as probable. Got hurt last week on the road against Utah, so his availability will be in question for this ball game. So that's why you have to keep an eye out whether he's 100% healthy. We have to keep an eye out on the medical reports. But I like Arizona State in this matchup. Their ability with quarterback Taylor Kelly to stretch defenses, and then DJ Foster, a very solid, underrated running back. Jalen Strong's also nicked up as well. He's listed as probable, had a concussion last week, but he passed tests, and he's probable for this matchup. So, in my opinion, I think Arizona State's speed on the offensive end is the issue. They're able to create turnovers in the secondary, have faced some pretty good teams up until this point, and I like Todd Graham in this matchup going up against Rich Rod. In my opinion, Arizona is still a little younger in terms of experience. I like the experience by Arizona State and Taylor Kelly in this matchup to get the victory on Saturday.
We're joined by Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com. As we move it to the Big Ten, we've got a game that is always within these two states a big game, big rivalry game, one of those many trophy games in the Big Ten for Paul Bunyan's Axe, but it usually doesn't mean a whole lot in the standings. But this year it means everything. The Minnesota Golden Gophers, with a win over Iowa and Nebraska, have set themselves up to possibly get to the Big Ten championship. Who would have thought this at the start of the season? So they travel to Madison to take on a Wisconsin team that's playing its best football right now.
It's incredible. The whole key for Minnesota, both of these teams mirror images of each other, Mark. Minnesota likes to run the football, has a very heavy offensive line, and a very solid running back in Cobb. He got hurt in the second half on the road in Lincoln last week, listed as questionable for this ball game. So we have to see his status a little bit later in the week, whether he's a go or not. but they have a solid backup in Donnell Kirkwood as well. Very tough inside runner between the tackles. So if Cobb can't go, I think they're okay with Kirkwood at the running back position. This defense by Minnesota, very opportunistic. They're plus 12 in turnover margin, only giving up about 192 passing yards per game. They were able to keep Tommy Armstrong and that high-octane Nebraska offense in check and create turnovers on the road. Not going to be easy on the road in Camp Randall. It's a rivalry game, but I think if they could stuff the box and force Joel Stabby to beat them with his arm, Minnesota has an advantage with their secondary. I like the way they're playing right now. They played Ohio State down to the wire, lost the game by 7 points, played a very tough matchup. Last week came from behind against Nebraska. I like the way this Minnesota team is playing, Mark. I think they get the upset this coming Saturday over Wisconsin and Melvin Gordon.
Wow. Yeah, that Gophers backfield, defensive backfield has played extremely well. Minnesota with 26 takeaways on defense, much of that coming from the defensive backfield. They held Amir Abdullah in check to about 4 yards a carry. He didn't go off on them. Of course, Melvin Gordon's gone off on just about everybody he's faced, so that's going to be a key matchup. And you mentioned David Cobb possibly not being a go. I think that really hurts them. You mentioned Kirkwood coming into the game. He ran for a big 20-yard touchdown as they came back and beat Nebraska. But Cobb is just a guy that makes that offense go with those runs between the tackles. So, yeah, Minnesota-Wisconsin winner goes to Indianapolis in the Big Ten championship game to take on Ohio State. The Buckeyes have it sewn up in the East, but they're thinking much bigger than just the Big Ten as they try to get into the college football playoff. One of the greatest rivalries in sports, Ohio State-Michigan. The Wolverines, though, 5-6, and most likely Brady Hoke's final game at Michigan. So Buckeyes and Wolverines, does Michigan have any chance of an upset here?
I think they do. I think when you look at Michigan overall, Mark, they're minus 14 in turnover margin. That's 119th out of 125 in the country. That's why they're 5-6 on the year. Their inconsistency by Devin Gardner at the quarterback position, making ill throws, has really hurt the Wolverines. Defensively, though, Mark, playing very, very solid. Only giving up 194 passing yards per game, and more importantly, only 107 rushing yards per game. I think if Brady Hoke and Doug Nussmeier can use a ball-controlled attack, rely on that defense to create field position, they have an opportunity in this matchup. I don't think they'll open it up against Ohio State. I look for a low-scoring affair. You look at that matchup at home in the Horseshoe last weekend with Indiana and Ohio State. Ohio State struggled with Tevin Coleman at the running back position for Indiana. They struggled with the offensive line blocking scheme. They're giving up about 147 rushing yards per game. I like Michigan's offensive line. Throw the records out the window in this ball game. I think Michigan strikes the upset in the Horseshoe this weekend, Mark. This game went down to the wire last year in Ann Arbor. I know you're not going to be happy about it, but I'm calling for the upset on your show. Michigan knocks Ohio State out of playoff contention this weekend. I think it's a very low-scoring game, though. Look for a 20-17 victory by Michigan. We're going back to the days of Earl Bruce and Bo Schembechler. This is an upset in the making this weekend in the Horseshoe.
Okay. The reasons I can see this possibly happening, you mentioned Devin Gardner, who's been a big disappointment the last 2 years, but he had a monster game against Ohio State last year. 55 yards passing. He was exceptional in that game, running and throwing. 2 years ago, he almost pulled off the upset against the 12-0 Ohio State team in Columbus. 26-21 game went down to the wire. You mentioned the Michigan defense. For as bad as the Wolverines are at 5-6, the defense is pretty good. They've held them in a lot of games. It's just been repeated 3-and-outs by the offense that's put the defense in bad situations, but nobody's really scoring a whole lot of points against this Michigan defense. I would say Ohio State's offense is just a little too much firepower, and the defense is better than what we saw in that 42-41 game, although what we saw last week against Indiana wouldn't necessarily attest to that. All right, Joe, we got a huge string in the SEC. Many of these matchups involve the ACC as well, and, of course, those big games that affect the college football playoff situation. So I'm going to start it in Athens with the Georgia Bulldogs taking on Georgia Tech. The Yellow Jackets very much under the radar the entire season, but they have snuck into the ACC championship game. They're playing their best football. They really laid it to Clemson a couple of weeks ago. And Georgia, when they've got their A game on, it can be as good as anybody in the country.
Absolutely, Mark. Georgia's owned the series. They're 12-1 since 2001 against Georgia Tech. So really, numbers-wise, really favors Georgia in this matchup. You look at this Georgia Tech defense, very opportunistic there, +10 in turnover margin, and more importantly, +8 in turnover margin on the road. Playing very well, have a solid defensive line. Their struggles have been in the secondary, giving up about 223 passing yards per game. You look at this Georgia offense, very balanced over the last couple of weeks in victories over Western Carolina and their victory on the road in Lexington, Kentucky, where Hudson Mason broke out with a 4-touchdown performance on the road against the Wildcats. You saw Malcolm Mitchell get more involved in the passing offense over the last couple of weeks. Chris Conley starting to get more involved, and Mike Bobo utilizing the wide receivers. I think that's the defense. That's the game for Georgia. I think they could exploit a lot of holes in that Georgia Tech secondary. And then defensively, Georgia has the game against Auburn under their belt. Jeremy Pruitt knows Georgia Tech from his days in the ACC conference last year with Florida State. He also was able to shut down the triple option attack of Gus Malzahn, not the same style that Paul Johnson runs, but still similar types of movement on the offensive line, and I think that'll benefit Georgia defensively. I think this is a dominant victory by the Bulldogs at home. They have ACC championship berth should Arkansas knock off Missouri, and if should Arkansas knock off Missouri on Friday, expect a big effort out of the Bulldogs on Saturday with a possible playoff berth hanging in the balance. I think Georgia dominates this matchup over Georgia Tech. I don't even think it's close. I think it's a 20-point victory by the Bulldogs on Saturday.
Yeah, in terms of a scenario, it's kind of strange because you can look at it one way and say this game means nothing, and then on the other hand, it means a whole bunch. So for Georgia Tech, they, of course, won a race, 1-12 against Mark Richt, 4-18 the last 22 years. They have been downtrodden in this series because Georgia usually is the more dominant football program. But Georgia Tech's locked into the ACC championship game. They're most likely going to go to the Orange Bowl if Florida State makes it to the college football playoff. But they strengthen their case, and of course it's a rival game. For Georgia, again, it doesn't affect the SEC, but if they want to keep that glimmer of hope alive for the college football playoff, they need to win this game, of course, and then the hope that Mizzou goes down so that they can get another shot against the top team in the SEC title game. Okay, we got another in-state rivalry that's always one of the best, and we've got Florida taking on Florida State. The Noles at 11-0 continue to get by marginal competition, and they've got the larger number on the scoreboard when it hits 00, but whether it's Louisville, Notre Dame, Boston College, NC State, they continue to get challenged, but Jameis Winston makes the plays in the second half, and the defense comes up with enough stops. For Florida, this defense is extremely strong. Aside from the Alabama effort early in the season, despite the issues on offense, I think the Gators have the athletes and the speed and the athleticism on defense to make this a game. Your thoughts about Florida State playing at home against the Gators and Will Muschamp's farewell?
I think this is a very difficult matchup for Florida because you look at their secondary. They've struggled in terms of team stretching them vertically. They're giving up about 201 passing yards per game. You saw what Alabama was able to do earlier in the year with Amari Cooper and working their running backs out and wheel routes. They really exploited some of the holes in the Florida secondary. I think Florida State, predominantly a pass-heavy offense that's averaging 314 passing yards per game, statistically on the bottom half of 1A in terms of rushing offense. Entering that game against BC, they were statistically ranked 104th in the country, only around 130 rushing yards per game. The strength of the Florida defense is run support, only giving up 110 rushing yards per game, but I look for Jameis Winston and Rashad Green and those wide receivers to stretch Florida vertically. I look for Carlos Williams and Dalvin Cook to be utilized in the flat in the passing game, and I think this is a dominant effort out of Florida State this weekend. You look at the offense for Florida, statistically at the bottom half of the SEC in terms of passing offense. Treon Harris really hasn't developed and matured from a passing perspective, and I think this is a very difficult spot for Florida. I expect Florida State to start fast, put a lot of pressure on that Gator offense. I think this is a dominant Florida State victory on Saturday, and they prove that they deserve to be in the playoff contention with a dominant effort over their arch rival.
Yeah, and trying to make
Florida this weekend.
I'm sorry, Joe, you cut out there for a second, so I started talking. But in trying to make a case for Florida in pulling off the upset, I think you bring up two good points that go against that. Jameis Winston against the suspect pass defense, and also the games in Tallahassee, although the Gators went there 2 years ago and pulled off a win 30-20. I do like Gators the Gators' run defense against the Florida State running game that's been pretty non-existent, considering the offensive talent they've got on the line and in the backfield, and also that the Gators could just throw caution to the wind, let Jeff Driscoll go out there and fling it around, and that running game was so dominant against Georgia, I could see them hammer down a 20-17 game, maybe similar to what you're looking at in Columbus with Ohio State and Michigan. All right, Joe, I throw this one in there because it's still extremely huge within the Palmetto State. So South Carolina, Clemson, both coming off somewhat disappointing seasons, especially Steve Spurrier's crew at 6-5. They were supposed to win the SEC Eastern Division. They own this series over Clemson. So the Tigers, under Taj Boyd, Sammy Watkins, had dynamic teams, but continued to get pounded by Jadeveon Clowney and the likes against South Carolina. So we got a 6-5 Gamecock team taking on the Clemson Tigers, looking for a better bowl bid and to break this long series drought against South Carolina.
I think this matchup favors Clemson, not just because I'm wearing the shirt, Mark. It's because of their defense led by Vic Beasley. You look at that game last week with Georgia Tech a couple of weeks ago. They struggled because of the turnovers committed by Cole Stout at the quarterback position, had two interception returns for touchdowns, put a lot of pressure on that offense. Deshaun Watson went down early in the first quarter. His status for this game is still up in the air, but defensively, I think Clemson has a significant advantage of going up against that offensive line for South Carolina. And on the other end, Clemson's wide receivers and the Clemson offense, I look to put a lot of pressure on a very suspect Gamecock secondary. You look at that win on the road against Florida. Florida was able to sort of grind it out against South Carolina. Really couldn't get anything going in the second half of that ball game. But I think Clemson will challenge that Gamecock secondary. They've struggled not only in passing offense but in rushing run support over a couple of games against Tennessee and against Missouri. I believe it was Missouri. They struggled in run support, did not look good. Auburn. They gave up over 300 yards of rushing offense to both of those teams. So they really haven't looked good from a defensive perspective over the last few weeks. And I think that's where Clemson will exploit the South Carolina holes in the defense. And I think this is a dominant effort either way, whether Deshaun Watson can go or Cole Stout. I think Clemson picks up a convincing victory over the old ball coach. I think they have too much defensive talent going up in this matchup.
That's an impossible pick for me right at this point because of what you mentioned at the quarterback position for the Clemson Tigers. I got to know that Deshaun Watson's going to be on the field. They're a completely different team, 40 points per game with him on the field, like 22, 23 with Cole Stout. They're just much more limited. They limped home to wins against the likes of NC State and Syracuse and Boston College and relied on the defense holding those teams under 20 points with Cole Stout at the quarterback position. All right, we finished with a flurry with these huge 3 games in the SEC. Missouri can win the East. They got it right in their hands, but they're taking on an Arkansas team and will have their hands full in Columbia. The Hogs are hot, pitching shutouts against LSU and Arkansas, and with that running game, Mizzou They showed us some offense against Texas A&M and to a lesser degree against Tennessee, but it's been the defense with Marcus Golden and Shane Ray just living in opponents' backfields this year in leading this Mizzou defense.
Well, Missouri, a lot of pressure on Missouri. Credit their defense last week for a dominant effort in holding Tennessee and Joshua Dobbs to under 60 yards rushing for the game. That was a dominant effort. Held Tennessee to 1.8 yards rushing. But you look at their 2 losses on the year to Indiana and Georgia. Both run-heavy offenses. Indiana out of the conventional spread attack with Tevin Coleman, and Georgia with a more pro-style attack with a heavy offensive line. But both of those teams got major yards against the Missouri defense right up the middle through the A and B gaps. You look at Tennessee last week, they try to challenge that Missouri Tiger defense on the outside. That's not how you beat Missouri with your running attack. You have to run up the middle. That's the way Arkansas is built. Now, Arkansas has a question mark at the quarterback position. Brandon Allen is questionable for this ball game. His status is still unclear at this time. If he can't go, his younger brother, Austin Allen, will get the start. He's a freshman, a little bit raw, but if that's the case, then this makes Arkansas one-dimensional. I think it's imperative for Arkansas to score first in this game. I think they can do it because of the way their offensive line is playing, and defensively they're going to have to create turnovers on the road. They created 6 turnovers last week at home against Bo Wallace and that Ole Miss offense. I like the way they're playing in the secondary. I think Arkansas strikes the upset. I don't think it's a blowout. I think it's a very close victory by the Razorbacks, but I think it comes down to a field goal, and Arkansas gets a 23-20 victory on the road in Columbia, but it is not easy for the Razorbacks in this game.
Yeah, you mentioned the Allen quarterback situation. Brandon left last week's game against Ole Miss. His brother Austin comes in as a sophomore. He's actually a much more heralded player at this point, but has very, very limited experience. That's pretty much it. But he came in and got some playing time, so at least he's warmed up for this one, possibly if they need him at Missouri. All right, Joe, typically the Egg Bowl is a nice little matchup in-state, Mississippi, Rebels, Bulldogs, a lot of pride on the line there, and usually a couple 6-5, 7-4 teams going at it, trying to up their bowl status. But this year, completely different. Ole Miss was vying for a national championship. They've fallen off. They've got 3 losses. But for Mississippi State, it's all still right there for them, possibly, unless the College Football Playoff Committee keeps them out at 11-1 and they don't get any help from Auburn. So we got Ole Miss coming off that deplorable effort against Arkansas, when I thought even with the 2 losses, they were still one of the best teams in the country because they were 2 extremely narrow losses in tough spots. But Ole Miss falling apart, now having to rebound without Laquan Treadwell. Mississippi State goes to Oxford as a 1-point favorite, I believe, at this point, and Dak Prescott and company trying to complete the deal and get to the playoffs.
Well, Mississippi State has won 4 of the last 5, Mark, so that favors the Bulldogs in this matchup. But you look at Ole Miss playing very well at home. They're +8 in turnover margin and +6 in turnover margin overall at home. That favors the Rebels. This team should be undefeated if you think about it. They lost that game to Auburn on basically almost the last play of the game with the Laquan Treadwell injury, fumbled the ball on the 1-yard line. Other than that, Ole Miss would be perfect at home this year. So I think that favors Ole Miss in this matchup. Defensively, only giving up 130 rushing yards per game. I think they can shut down Josh Robinson and Dak Prescott. They're very solid in the middle of that defense with Kandichi leading and anchoring that defensive line. And more importantly, the secondary, led by Pruitt and Golson, to me, has an advantage over Dak Prescott in that offense. Dak Prescott, 8 interceptions over the last 6 games. I think that's the difference. Look for Hugh Freeze to throw caution to the wind. They're out of the playoff at this point, 3 losses on the year, and I still like Ole Miss at home. Oxford, a very difficult place to play. I think they strike the upset 30-24 over Mississippi State.
Yeah, and you bring up Dak Prescott's recent issues. He got off to the solid start. He's leading a top 4 football team, so he's had a great year on one hand, but he's had recent issues, after the explosion against Kentucky, where they put up a lot of points on the road in Lexington. Really, the offense has been held down by the likes of Arkansas, Alabama, and so forth, besides exploding last week against Vandy. We're going to dismiss that effort 51-0. But against quality defenses, not real strong for Mississippi State in the passing game in recent weeks. And that Ole Miss secondary is one of the best in the country. All right, it comes down to the Iron Bowl, Joe. We've got Auburn taking on Alabama. All the pride's on the line. But again, for a sixth year, we could possibly have the winner of this game going on to the national championship game. It's happened since 2009, twice for Auburn, 3 times for Alabama. The Tigers look to be a championship contender as of just a few weeks ago, but they've, like Ole Miss, have kind of fallen on hard times, and the wheels have come off to a certain extent. Alabama and Blake Sims are 1 win away from the SEC championship game and securing their bid as the #1 team in the country.
Very difficult matchup, Mark. I like Auburn in this matchup, but let's talk defensively for the Tigers. Going to be without Devontae Lambert, their big play defensive end, out for the rest of the year with a knee injury. He had surgery. Gus Malzahn said that's a big blow for the defense. So look for Auburn to really utilize different defensive fronts to sort of confuse that Alabama offensive line. But it's, to me, the difference is the Auburn offense. You look at Nick Marshall, you look at his ability to catch the edge of the defense. You can go back to that Tennessee game against Alabama 4 weeks ago. In my opinion, that Alabama defense struggled with Joshua Dobbs' mobility. He got some yards in the second half. Tennessee was able to rack up 181 rushing yards on that Alabama defense. When Mississippi State was able to play them, in my opinion, Dan Mullen did not call a good first half of that ball game. I thought they would utilize Dak Prescott's running ability. They did not do that. Only called his number 5 times. He only had 24 yards in the first half. They went to Dak Prescott in the rushing attack in the second half after they were down 19-0, and they really took away their game plan, in my opinion. You have to be able to rush the football on the edge with your quarterback like Marshall, and I think that can create some problems for that Alabama defense. Not only that, but the secondary has been burned down the middle of the field. You can look at all 3 of their games against West Virginia, Ole Miss, and that victory a few weeks ago against Mississippi State. They had wide open receivers down the middle of the seam. Landon Collins and that secondary have not matched up well with big wide receivers, and I think that's where the advantage for Auburn lies. You look at Duke Williams coming back and Sammy Coates on the outside, 2 big play wide receivers that can stretch the middle of the field against Alabama's secondary. To me, that's the difference. I think they can utilize a ball control attack and create some defensive mismatches for that Crimson Tide defense, and I think Auburn strikes the upset on the road. They matched up very well last year. They struggle with Nick Marshall's mobility, and I'm calling for the upset again this year. Auburn knocks off Alabama, and we have Armageddon, week number 14 of the college football season.
I would love to cycle through all your picks, add it up, and see what the results would be after that, and then try to figure out what the College Football Playoff Committee would see going into championship weekend. So let's see if I've got this straight. And I actually did a little odds makers math a couple nights ago and figured out that there have been 51 top 25 upsets in the 13 weeks of play. So that's 4 per week, and I went through the weeks, and it's about 4 per week. So we can count on some upsets here. So if I got this right, Joe, you got Texas over TCU, correct?
Yes.
You got both games in the Big Ten going to the underdog. Minnesota on the road at Wisconsin, and Michigan, I haven't checked the line, but I'm guessing it's like 17 or 18 at Ohio State, winning over the Buckeyes.
Correct, and it's more like 21 at this point in Vegas.
1 point. Well, I don't expect the Buckeyes to cover that, but wow, 21-point favorites going down in flames, losing a Big Ten game for the first time in forever. Arkansas winning on the road at Missouri, sending Georgia to the championship game. Ole Miss, after getting shellacked at Arkansas, coming back, bouncing back against an 11-1 Mississippi State team, pulling off the upset in the Egg Bowl. In the Iron Bowl, going to the underdog as well with Auburn upsetting Alabama.
Correct, Mark. That's what I'm pulling for. Upset City on week number 14.
That would be amazing to say the least. That would be crazy. All right, Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com. You got to check out his website. He is a college football maniac. He breaks down the games. If you listen to any of this analysis, you can tell that he lives it, breathes it, eats it all the time, and he loves it just as I do. So we enjoy having him on every Tuesday night, late night, to talk it up. And, of course, we've got this available as a podcast a little bit later on the day on Wednesday. Joe, thanks so much for joining us.
Mark, always a pleasure. Love the show. Have a happy Thanksgiving to you and your family. I'll see you after the weekend.